You know what the book of Proverbs says? Chapter 18, it says, the mouth of the fool calls for blows. It says when you say something stupid, your mouth invites somebody to hit you in the face. The Bible actually tells you that. So what am I trying to tell you? When you have stuff happen in your life that's your own darn fault, don't go start playing the persecution card. When you get fired from your job because you're late or lazy or whatever, don't go, oh, they're persecuting me because I'm a Christian. No, they're firing you because you're lazy.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
We've been in a study of the Beatitudes, and we've been looking at this amazing introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. And the whole Beatitudes is upside down. All these blessings are kind of backwards. You know, our world esteems fame and fortune and ambition, and Jesus seems to esteem mercy and meekness and humility and those sort of things. And as you look and read through the words of Jesus, you find out that he actually had a lot of things that he said that were upside down. For example, he said the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And he told us that basically the way up is down and the way down is up. And one of the things he told us, again in a roundabout way, was that the real winners in this world are losers. And so this morning my message is entitled, Winning Losers. Some of you are thinking, hey, finally something I qualify for. How many of you are thinking that? Oh, you're going to identify yourself? Well, okay, I guess that's all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the book of Matthew, and we're going to read the last of the 8 Beatitudes, and then I'm going to try to sum this whole picture up. And so here it is, Matthew chapter 5, verse 10, and it says this, Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I'm wondering if you've noticed this. Out of all of the Beatitudes, all 8 of them, this was the only one that he took a moment to explain. He just bangs through the first 7. He just states them. He doesn't say what they mean, doesn't explain them. And yet he gets to the last one, Blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. And he takes a couple of verses to explain it. Just in case you don't know what I mean, this is what they're going to do. They're going to say all kinds of evil about you, and they're going to revile you, and they're going to hate you, and they're going to maybe even kill you. And but don't worry about it. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad. I don't know. There's something wrong with this picture. Now, what does it mean? I'll just remind you, last week we talked about the peacemaker as someone who has made peace with God, who has been reconciled with God, and their job is to reconcile themselves to one another and the world to one another and ultimately to God. And really, we are the reconcilers. We are those who have the ministry of reconciliation to invite people who are far from God to be reconciled with their Creator. And that's what a peacemaker is. So that's the journey we've been on. And then he finally gets to the end of the Beatitudes. And then he says, if you can accomplish all of this, he says, this is what will happen when you become the peacemakers in your world. They will persecute you for righteousness' sake. They will say all kinds of evil about you. They will revile you for my sake. But rejoice and be exceedingly glad. You know what? This is like the worst sales pitch in the entire world. I mean, really? I mean, if Jesus was selling cars, how well do you think he would do with this sales pitch? And, you know, no offense to Jesus. I know he knows what he's talking about. But this is a ridiculous sales pitch because all over the world, there is persecution that most of us will never know or never even really understand. It is so intense around the world. There are people who follow these sort of things. And last year, they say that it was the greatest persecution in Christian history last year. And 2,400 churches were destroyed, blown up, or burned to the ground last year. In fact, while I was preaching this morning at the end of the service, an Egyptian man from Cairo came up to me and told me this at the end of the service. He said, Pastor Mark, did you know that this morning alone in Cairo, a church was blown up? 25 dead, 50 injured. That happened this morning, and that was the third church in 3 days that had been blown up in Cairo. And so this is what's happening around the world. Last year, 7,100 Christians were executed for their faith. I'm not talking about Christians who died in places like the Congo where there's civil war between factions and Christians are being, mass murdered. There was about 100,000 in Congo alone. I'm talking about people that were specifically specified for execution and were taken out because of their faith, 7,100 people. Let me show you a map of the persecuted world. And these are the countries that are the most persecuted places in the world. And the red are the most severe, and then the orange, less severe, and the green a little bit less. And you can see that where it is, it's in the 1040 window, it's in the Middle East. In fact, the most persecuted church in the world is in North Korea. And North Korea is an unbelievable place where it's illegal to be a Christian, it's illegal to proselytize or evangelize. The ironic thing is that South Korea is the most Christianized country in the world. Biggest churches in the world are in Seoul, South Korea. Most Christians, probably somewhere around 40 or 50% of the entire population of South Korea is Christians. Meanwhile, north of the demilitarized zone, it's illegal to be a Christian. So missionaries are going in their zealousness across. They're being executed. They're being imprisoned. Today, there are 70,000 Christians in labor camps, concentration camps in North Korea. And most of us don't actually even realize what's going on. To be a Christian in the Middle East today, we don't talk about persecution. We certainly don't start with it. In the Middle East, in an Arab country today, if you were going to become a Christian, this is probably the first thing you would discuss. Because when you become a Christian, you will probably be excommunicated from your family. You will probably be in jeopardy from your community. To be a Christian in these countries is literally taking your life in your hands. I want to show you a symbol. Some of you might recognize this. This is the Arabic letter for N. And what ISIS is doing in Iraq and Syria and places like that is when they identify a home of Christian family, they go and they put this symbol, N, on the wall. They literally spray paint it on the wall. And what it is it stands for Nasrani. And Nasrani is the Arabic word for Christian. It actually means Nazarene, but it's a pejorative term. It's an insult. It's a racial slur. And they will go and they will mark this home. And if you go home and you see that your house has been marked with the N, then you have only a few choices. And probably the thing for you to do is to flee the country, which many of them do. And that's why many of these Syrian Christians have just left, and they've left their houses and left their belongings, and they didn't even go back to their house. Or you can renounce your faith and convert to Islam, or you can face possible execution if you determine to live like a Christian in an ISIS-controlled area of the world. But I'm going to show you this picture, which some of you might have seen. It was a YouTube clip. And these three men were hauled out of their homes for being Christians. And they were held at gunpoint by these terrorists who have guns to the backs of their head. Talk about cowards. What could be more cowardly than shooting another human being in the back of the head? But that's what they did. And then they asked them to renounce their faith, and if they don't renounce their faith, they shoot them in the head. And so then this is what happened on this particular clip, and this is what the audio was. They asked these men, and they said, "What is your name?" And all three of these men said, "I am Nasrani. I am Nasrani. I am Nasrani." All three of them, instead of saying their name, they said what their belief was. They admitted that they were Christians. And the next frame of this, which I'm not going to show you, they were shot in the head and dead. You say, why would they do that? Why would they not protect their lives? I'll tell you why. Jesus says that he who tries to save his life in this world will lose it, but he who gives up his life will gain it. You see, that the winning losers are people who are willing to lose their life in this world to win the grand prize of eternity, that we would have life. You see, it tells us about it in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, and it says this. It says, "But those who are faithful to the death will receive the crown of life." Some people call that the martyr's crown. And you know what? We don't actually have the liberty. We live in a safe part of the world where we don't have to make that choice. But when push comes to shove, we have to decide whether we're going to serve Christ or whether we're not going to serve Christ. You see, we don't understand this level of persecution. It's going on in the world even today, as I've said. And we live in cozy, comfortable North America, and we think, wow, I'm glad that doesn't happen here. But all over the world it is. And I know it's kind of terrifying to think of these things and these images, but here's what I want to remind you, was when the 11 disciples of the 12 were all died in a martyr's death, there was one who didn't, and his name was John. And John lived and died of old age. And here was what happened. They actually tried to kill him, and legend tells us that they tried to burn him in oil and could not kill him. And so they exiled him to the island of Patmos. And here's what I believe. I believe that they could not kill him because his time was not yet. And when God has a purpose for you on this earth, he will move heaven and earth to preserve your life. And my question for you as a Christian today is, why are we so fearful of death? And see, the disciples, the martyrs, embraced their fate. And if your time is not up yet, you need to understand that God will preserve your life. Why don't we believe it when he says that your life is in his hand and no one can snatch you from it? God will protect us. And for every one of these martyr stories that I could tell you, I bet there's hundreds. No, I bet there are thousands of stories of how God preserved life. I'm going to tell you one of these stories, and it was a recent story. A Christian in Vietnam had decided that he was going to smuggle Bibles into North Vietnam, and he was going to distribute them. And it's illegal for him to do that, and the church in Vietnam is an underground church and a persecuted church. But anyway, he decided he was going to do it anyway, and he prayed, and he asked for God's protection, and he had a box of Bibles, and he got on the bus in Ho Chi Minh City, and he had a 12-hour trip up to the north where he was going, and he put the box on the floor beside him. The very next person to get on the bus was a police captain, and he went and sat in the seat beside him right at the box. He took off his cap and put his hat on the box of Bibles. He sort of curled up like this and fell asleep. They went on the 12-hour journey, and during that 12-hour journey, they went through no less than 10 checkpoints. At every one of those checkpoints, the soldiers got on the bus, searched every single parcel on that bus, with the exception of the box, because it had the captain's hat on it. And he made it all the way to his destination, where he delivered those box of Bibles and realized that when God's grace is with you, there is nothing and no one who can stop you. Amen? So let's talk about this for a moment. What does that mean then for us? What would it mean to be persecuted? Well, let me start with telling you what it doesn't mean. Let me tell you what persecution is not. He says, blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. Persecution is not when you suffer for stupidity's sake. That's something different. You can do that all on your own. You say, huh? Well, let me just show you the verse here, because Peter talks about it, and it's in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20. It says, for what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. So Peter, using my vernacular, says, look, if you get beaten and if you get punished or suffer for being stupid, that's your own fault. And you shouldn't go and blame that on God. I have a little story to tell you about that. And some of you heard this story before, and it bears repeating because it makes fun of me and you'll like it. And it's about where I learned the lesson between righteousness and stupidity. And here's how it worked. We were actually literally out on the street, and we were sharing the gospel, so it started out okay. And we were down right on Main Street, and we were right on Main Street Strip where all the action happens on a Friday night, and we were working out of the Lighthouse Mission actually that particular night. And what we were doing was we were sharing the gospel with people on the streets, and then we invited them back, and we were feeding them and giving them coffee and all kinds of things. And so this was going, and one of the things I used to do when I went down was I just got a brand new black leather jacket. And if I was going to go hang out downtown, I'm going to wear my jacket because I feel tough in black leather. How many of you feel tough when you wear your black leather jacket? Why are all these skinny guys putting up their hands? Anyway, it's the best we can do. I get it. And so I had skinny jeans on, black leather jacket. I felt pretty tough that night. And so we were out on the street, and we were sharing the gospel. We gathered a bunch of people, and a lot of them were inebriated and whatever. And so we had them in. It was actually going fairly well in the mission. It was actually going reasonably well. And then this totally drunk as a skunk, inebriated man comes into the building, and he's ranting, and he's raving, and he's belligerent, and he's swearing, and he's yelling, and everybody got nervous, and they said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I said, like John Wayne, I'll take care of it. Remember, I was in a black leather jacket, and so I felt tough. Well, not to mention that I sized him up. He was about 6 inches shorter than me, and I thought to myself, I can take him. And so anyway, to calm the group down, I said, I'll take care of it. And then, I swagger at the best of times, but, in this moment, I really swaggered. And I put on my best swagger, and I was like John Wayne going across the saloon. And I went to the other side, and I faced him down like this, and I put my hands on my hips, and I said, so what seems to be the problem, Pilgrim? I didn't say Pilgrim, but I might as well have. I was being such an idiot. And so I said, so what seems to be the problem? And as I said that, staring him down, trying to intimidate him, he stops. Remember, he's drunk as a skunk. He stops. He looks at me just for a second. And you know what he did? He hauled off and he sucker punched me. And he just goes, all of a sudden I'm there, boom! And I'm lying on the ground. And I'm thinking to myself, what am I doing down here? I thought that was really weird. Why am I on the ground? And I started to get up. I looked at everybody. I was kind of seeing stars and a bit dizzy. I said, did I win? Did I solve the problem? I said, I'd take care of that. Well, since that day, I've thought about that incident many times. And I'd love to tell you that what had happened was I was out in the street and I was persecuted for righteousness' sake. But the truth was I was out in the street and I was persecuted for stupidity's sake was what happened. I was trying to intimidate him. I was trying to act tough. And as soon as you cross over that, you know what the book of Proverbs says? Chapter 18, it says, the mouth of the fool calls for blows. It says when you say something stupid, your mouth invites somebody to hit you in the face. The Bible actually tells you that. So what am I trying to tell you? When you have stuff happen in your life that's your own darn fault, don't go start playing the persecution card. When you get fired from your job because you're late or lazy or whatever, don't go, oh, they're persecuting me because I'm a Christian. No, they're firing you because you're lazy. If you get kicked out of school because you've got poor grades, don't go, well, the teacher's ganging up on me because I'm a Christian. No, because you're not very bright, right? You can just go on and on with this. When you do things and you bring it onto yourself, you can't go and play the persecution card. What you did was, you get kicked out of your apartment because you didn't pay your rent. Guess what? It's not because you're a Christian. It's because you're a deadbeat. There's a difference. And so we can get persecuted for stupidity's sake. Peter says there's no glory in that whatsoever. So that's what persecution is not. So what is persecution then? If that's what it isn't, what is it? And persecution, Jesus tells us, he said, when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, when you're persecuted for doing the right thing. Paul reminds us this in 1 Timothy. He said this. He said, all who desire to live godly will suffer, finish it for me, persecution. Only 3 of you know it. Any of you have that one up on your fridge? All who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. A couple of you, good for you. So, if you're going to live righteously, you're going to actually pay a price for it. People are going to persecute you. See, here's the amazing thing about it. Particularly in the North American context. Aren't you glad that this building probably won't blow up today and kill you all? Although we are having trouble with the boiler, so, just saying. But aren't you glad we don't? But it doesn't mean there's not persecution. And see, here's what happens. When you decide you're going to live like a Christian in our society, people will revile you, and people will criticize you, and people will judge you. You know what I'm talking about. You go to work, and you work harder than everybody else, and the people that are, sort of lagging behind judge you because they think, well, why are you working so hard? Putting on this big show. And you're one of these people that vulgarity doesn't come out of your mouth, and they go, oh, the guy's a real goody two-shoes. Or you're one of those people that praise before you eat. Did any of you do that? Really? Like 10 of you? Good for you. Wow. I set you up for that, I know. So, you're one of those people who praise before you eat and say, well, that guy's a real religious fanatic. Or maybe you're one of those people that lives a sexually moral life. And you know what? In a culture that is sexually promiscuous as us, people actually judge you for being moral. It's kind of bizarre, isn't it? Let me tell you a story that's going on right now in Canada that many of you might not be aware of. And it has to do with Trinity Western University. Trinity Western University is a Christian university. It's in British Columbia. And if you go there as a student, you have to sign a code of conduct. And the code of conduct asks you to do this, that you will say that you will abstain from sexual activity except within the confines of a heterosexual marriage. That is, by the way, the biblical definition of sexuality, just in case you weren't clear of that either. And so it makes you sign that, and so that was fine. So people do that. They willingly do that. Nobody's holding a gun to their head. They go, they sign that. They know that's what the deal is. So a few years ago, Trinity Western decided they were going to start a law school. So everything seemed fine. They were going to start a law school. And then all of a sudden, something happened. The law societies of British Columbia, Ontario, and Nova Scotia said, that's fine if people want to graduate from your school, but just so you know, we will not license them to practice law in our province. Or in their terminology, we will not call them to the bar. That's the law society. I know some of you think being called to the bar is something different, but for a lawyer, it means something very specific. And so here's what I want you to think about what they've said. They've said, oh, you can have whatever religious freedom you want to go to whatever school you want. But then they said, we just won't let you earn a living in your chosen profession. That, I think, is the lowest form of discrimination. When you tell someone that they can't earn a living because of their religion, this is religious persecution happening in Canada. So Trinity Western had no choice, but they had to challenge it. And so they took it to court. First of all, they went to the Ontario Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of Ontario actually upheld the position of the Law Society. Then several months later, it went to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and British Columbia ruled exactly the opposite and said that it was religious discrimination. In fact, here's how it was worded. They said, this is an example of a well-intentioned desire of the majority in the name of tolerance to impose their views on a minority, and in fact, by ending up being intolerant themselves. You see, they actually called it like it was. So now we have this problem in Canada because we have two provincial Supreme Courts that have ruled separately on this. So this has to go to the Canadian Supreme Court, Canada's Supreme Court, and to be decided. This is something we have to pray about, because if Trinity Western loses this case, this means that it will be open season on Christians in Canada. And we don't think we have persecution. Let me tell you a story that happened right in this church a few years ago. I got a phone call one day from a journalist with one of the radio stations in town, which I will not mention by name to protect the guilty. And so she said this. She said, look, we're doing a series of stories on religious groups in Winnipeg, and we've done the Muslim mosque, and we've done a Buddhist temple. And we realize that our listeners don't really understand what evangelical Christianity is about. We were wondering if we could come in and do a story on Church of the Rock. And so I decided to let them do it. Some of my colleagues on staff were upset about it. And they said, Mark, aren't you nervous about this? And I said, yeah, you know, I don't have the contempt that Donald Trump has for the media, but I do have a healthy distrust. And so I said, no, I just feel like this is the right thing to do, and we're going to go for this. And so we invited this journalist to come into our fold. She spent actually several weeks with us, and she was completely blown away by you people. She couldn't believe the things we were doing in this church. She saw our bike ministry and how we fix bikes and give them to inner city kids that don't have bikes. She followed the Mexico trip of young people that were going to Mexico to minister to the poorest of poor. She was absolutely blown away. The fact that we do English as a second language classes and we offer them to new immigrants and new Canadians free of charge, she couldn't believe that. And then she was looking at a number of different things that we were doing, our Overcomers or Celebrate Recovery, a couple of different names where we have a ministry to people who are struggling with addictions. And she was just so overwhelmed by this. So then anyway, it came and they were going to run these stories, one every day for 5 days, Monday to Friday. So the first story came out, it was about a 15-minute long piece on the radio, and it was this glowing story, talking all about you. And she was genuinely impressed by this church and what this church does. Tuesday, another great story. Wednesday, a phenomenal story. Thursday, another fantastic story. And by this point, I'm feeling pretty good about my choice to let her into our midst. And I'm going around the office going, huh? Huh? What did I tell you? Well, am I a good judge of character or what? I didn't know what was coming on Friday. On Friday, the show starts and she's nowhere to be heard. Somehow, I don't know where she was. She wasn't on. Her producer had taken over the show. And they spent the entire 15 minutes trashing us. And they went after me, quoted things out of context, and just labeled us as a bunch of nutcases, seriously. They just thrashed us, and there was all kinds of irrational things, but it was vile, it was evil, it was terrible. It was just an awful 15 minutes, and I had to listen to this whole thing. So the next week, Monday, I phoned up this journalist trying to figure out where was she and what happened to our story? What happened to our fluff piece? And so I phone her up. She's not there. I phone her up a week later, still not getting any answer. So I leave a message for her to phone me back. I don't hear from her for several weeks. Finally, the phone rings, and it's her on the other end. And she said, Pastor Mark, I was unable to call you because I was so upset what had happened. She said, this is what happened. She says, all during the week while these stories were playing, we had viewers, or listeners rather, that were regular listeners that were phoning the radio station complaining that we were saying such positive things about the church. And they were beginning to put pressure on us, and our producer panicked, and he kicked me off the story, and he went and sat in the chair on his own, and he took the story, and he took you down in the midst of it. And she said, and then they turned on me. And she said, you know, I haven't been able to phone you because I have been so upset. I have been so victimized during this whole thing. She was guilty by association. She said, I didn't think there was religious persecution until I did this story about you. And she says, and I got it secondhand. And then she told me this. She says, my colleagues accused me of having an affair. I said, with whom? She said, you. I said, I don't remember that. And I absolutely cracked up. I mean, I shouldn't have laughed. She was so upset. And she was only getting it secondhand. But here's what you need to understand. See, I've been warned. Jesus told me. He said, don't be surprised when all kinds of people line up against you and they revile you and they persecute you and they speak all kinds of evil against you. Don't be surprised, but rejoice and be exceedingly glad. So I can embrace that from my Christian perspective. She, as a non-Christian, had no framework to deal with this. And so all she did was feel victimized. You see, here's what the scripture tells us. Woe to you when all men speak well of you. Isn't that what Jesus said? And here's what I would say. You shouldn't be upset when you encounter a little persecution for your faith. You should be upset if you're not getting a little persecution, because it means you're not doing it right. Let me tell you one final story in closing today, and it's about John Wesley. John Wesley is one of my heroes of faith. In the 1700s, he was a preacher. He was a field preacher, meaning he got on his horseback and he went out and he preached outside the churches and in town squares, and wherever he could preach, he preached. In his lifetime, and he preached well into his 80s, he preached 40,000 times, and he traveled 200,000 miles on horseback. There's a story about one day he was riding along on his horse, and it had dawned on him that he had not been persecuted for 3 whole days. And he got upset about it. And he got off his horse and he went down on a knee and he said, oh Lord, what have I done? Have I fallen out of your favor? It's been 3 days and there has not been an egg, there has not been a tomato, there has not been a brick thrown my way. Have I fallen out of favor? And just then there was a farmer on the other side of one of those stone fences like they have, and he was on the other side of this fence, and he heard this and he thought, I'll fix that old preacher. And he grabbed one of the stones from the fence and he threw it at John Wesley, narrowly missing him. At that, Wesley jumped to his feet and said, thank you, Lord, that your presence has not departed from me. That is a different perspective than most of us have on persecution. Jesus said, you will suffer persecution if you decide to live as a Christian. But rejoice and be exceedingly glad, because great is your reward in heaven. Let's stand together, shall we?
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.